We've told generations of kids, come up with your own values, come up with your own truth. And A, unless your name is Aristotle, you probably can't do it. But B, you don't live within a moral order. And a columnist named Walter Lippmann saw this coming as early as 1955. He wrote a book called The Public Philosophy. And he wrote that if what is right and wrong is just what each individual gets to decide based on his or her own feelings, we have left the realm of civilization. And I think we've left that realm. We're all sort of in a moral universe of one.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. Man, I'm so glad you joined us. Hey, is America over-politicized and under-moralized? Well, David Brooks thinks so. He's one of the leading commentators on America Today. He writes for the New York Times, The Atlantic, PBS NewsHour, and we talk about American church culture, becoming a Christian, what it was like to be pastored by Tim Keller, and a whole lot more. We've got show notes for you. If you click the link, here's what we can do. We can take it beyond the YouTube comments. We're going to post them in my private forum. It's called the Art of Leadership Academy. If you want a troll-free environment with other like-minded leaders, join the community. Absolutely free. You don't need a credit card. Just create an account. You'll be able to have rich conversations with church leaders from across America and around the world. Just go to careynieuwhof.com/show notes. Well, we'll jump into my conversation with David Brooks in just a moment. But first, a word from our carefully chosen partners. Today's episode is brought to you by my Art of Leadership Academy. So I recently heard Simon Sinek define community, and I thought it was really good. He thinks the difference in the future is going to be people who are part of the crowd, people who are part of the community. And he said, a community is a group of people who agree to grow together. Now, I love that because it's a simple definition. And that's exactly what this podcast is becoming. You know, for years, over a decade, this show was something you listen to on your own, right? You just put in your AirPods and away you go. You mow the lawn, take a drive, whatever you do. But now we've changed that. It's a place where you can start growing together. And here's how to do that. Yeah, definitely listen to the pod, watch it, whatever you're doing. But I want to invite you to join a community, not just an audience. This is a place where pastors and church leaders just like you wrestle with the same questions and move toward healthier leadership together. So in our free podcast community, here's what you're going to find. Thoughtful discussion, deeper insight into each episode, a space to reflect, share, and grow with others who are on the same journey, troll-free. So as you listen to today's episode, keep a couple of questions in mind. We'll be discussing them together as a group inside the free academy. Where have you seen your church get tangled up in politics? Okay, there's a big one. Do you have a space to discuss that? And then how do you lead through it? And then a second one, have you ever faced criticism for not speaking out on a political issue? And then the question is, how did you respond? Well, if you're already a member of the Art of Leadership Academy, head on over to the podcast community, jump into the conversation. And if not, you can join. There is a link in the description of this episode. Create a free account. No, nothing beyond that. Just click the link and you can get started. Or you can visit theartofleadershipacademy.com. I'm in there. I'd love for you to join the conversation, and it's time to be part of a community. Hope to see you in there soon. This episode is brought to you by the GLS. I don't need to tell you how demanding ministry has become. All right, you know it. Between burnout, complexity, and leading through constant change, the work you're doing takes deep wisdom and fresh perspective. And that's exactly why I make the Global Leadership Summit a priority every year. I'm going to be there in Chicago, happening August 7th through 8th at this year's Global Leadership Summit. It's 2 days of powerful, world-class faculty speaking into the real challenges that you face as a church leader. And here's what'll happen. You're going to walk away encouraged, inspired, and equipped to lead your church with greater clarity and with confidence. Now, because I'm going to be there and we have a partnership with the GLS, I've got an exclusive offer for podcast listeners. Use the code GLS25Carey and you'll get 10% off your ticket at a local host site or online. Act before the early bird deadline on July 16th. Your price drops from $221 to just $199, and the code works through August 7th, even as prices go up. So, you interested? Go to globalleadership.org/summit and use the coupon code GLS25Carey. That's GLS25Carey at checkout. I don't miss it because, frankly, I want to stay up on the latest stuff, and I love attending the Global Leadership Summit. So, will I see you there? This August, you lead others spiritually. Take the time to invest in yourself. David, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. Welcome.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
Yeah. So I'd love to begin by exploring your journey. I've thought about this question a lot. How does one become a widely regarded and read public journalist intellectual? I mean, it's not like that's not something you graduate from college with going, this is where my life is going to end up. How did that happen for you?
A lot of Machiavellian strategizing and kicking people on the way up. No, I sort of did think this is what I was going to be doing. When I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear. And I decided at that moment I wanted to become a writer. And so I've pretty much been writing every day since, literally every day, except for maybe 200 over the course of my adult life when I actually take a vacation or a Sabbath. But so I wake up in the morning and from 8 a.m. to usually about 1 p.m., I'm writing my 1,000 words. When my wife and I got married, she thought we were going to have long, leisurely breakfasts. But I really don't talk to another human being until have written 1,200 words. I used to wear a Fitbit, and it told me I was napping in the mornings. But I wasn't napping. I was just doing what God put me on this earth to do. And so I thought I was going to be a novelist. Then I thought I wanted to be a playwright. But then I got a job as a police reporter in Chicago. And I came home with a story every day. And so my personal life is kind of a jig-jaggy story. My faith life is a bit of a jig-jaggy story. But my career is a trajectory of pretty straight direction. I was a newspaper columnist in college, and now, 40 years later, I'm a newspaper columnist. So kind of boring.
You just have a few more readers than when you were on the police beat.
A few more readers and many more haters. But it's a pleasure that goes with the job.
Yeah. So let's talk about those first, 5 hours then. So you're up 8 a.m., you're at your desk, the world disappears, you've got no notifications, your Fitbit thinks you're asleep, and you're writing until around 1 o'clock. That's kind of an Ernest Hemingway approach, right? When the room finally warms up, you might be done. And you're shooting for about 1,200 words, did I hear you say?
Yeah, I think all writers have a formula. My favorite version of this is John Cheever, who was a short story novelist in the 1950s and 60s. And he would get up in his New York apartment building, put on his one suit, take the elevator down to the basement of the building where he had an office, take off his suit, write in his underwear. And then at 12:30, he would put back on his suit, get on the elevator, and go back upstairs and make himself lunch. And so that was his attempt to define a little ritual, and his attempt to pretend that he was a real worker because he put on a suit to go to work rather than writing in his underwear. And so that everyone has that routine. And my routine is only odd in the way I write. And so I have a pretty bad short-term memory. And so I have Post-it notes around me all the time. And when a random thought comes to me, I write it down on a Post-it note. And then if I'm doing research, I'll Xerox it and then mark up the pages. And so for me, the writing process is not tapping on a keyboard. It's taking maybe 200 or 300 pages of Post-it notes and Xerox pages and laying them out on my floor in piles. And each pile is a paragraph in my column or in a book. And so I may be only writing 1,000 words, but I'll have 14 piles of pages on the floor. And I pick up a pile and I write that paragraph. I throw out the pages. I pick up the next pile and write the pages. So to me, the writing process is not tapping on the keyboard. It's crawling around on the floor and organizing my piles. And that's when the inspiration comes. And so everybody has their technique.
Is it kind of like connecting the dots? Like what's in those piles?
Structure. It's about structure. It's getting things in the right order. And I tell my college students, your paper, if you don't have structure, your paper will jig-jag off in a million different directions. And if you do have structure, then the writing comes fast and easy. So I spend a lot of time getting things in the right order. And then I have clarity in my mind. And somehow I just must have like a geographical brain. I need to see it physically laid out on the floor in front of me for me to really understand what I'm saying.
So when you think about organization, I think one of the reasons you're so widely read is your articles are really compelling. So when you say, because we have a lot of writers and speakers watching and listening to this podcast, what do you mean by organization? Is that like logical flow? How does that work?
Sometimes it is logical flow. Like I wrote a very wonky column today on the American economy. So it's just in what order are you putting these boring statistics together so they make a coherent argument? But when I'm having trouble with a piece, the one thing I do is I don't try to fix it within the current structure. I start with a new structure. So I start with some point that currently was in the middle or toward the end, and I regurgitate it. So I don't try to fix it, because once it's got a bad structure, you can't fix it. You just have to tear it down and start from scratch. The second default when I have problems with structure is a go to narrative. So if there's any doubt about it, I put things in chronological order. That's just the normal way we speak. And I've come generally to think we always want to get people in storytelling mode. And so I never ask people, what do you think about this? I ask, how did you come to believe this? And that way they're telling me a story about some person who shaped their experiences or some event that happened to them. And if you can get people in storytelling mode, they're much more natural, and they're giving you a much more accurate version of who they are.
So that's like when you're doing the research for something or research for a piece, you get them in storytelling mode and then you incorporate that in your article?
Yeah. So I'll just ask people, like, well, I always, when I'm meeting strangers, I ask about their childhoods. I travel a lot, so I've probably been there. People love to talk about their childhoods. People love to talk about something they're proud of. So if they're wearing their son's hockey jersey or to their team, then I ask about that. And that's an icebreaker. And then, if you ask people, just, tell me about the high point of your life, the low point of your life, and the turning point of your life, that's a very simple frame, and everybody can do it. And you might ask me, well, how many times in my life has somebody said, that's too personal, none of your damn business? And the answer is zero. I mean, you ask people questions for a living, and it turns out if you ask people respectfully about their life story, no one has ever asked them. And so they love telling you that story. And then as you get to know people, I find I try to ask them questions that take them above their normal lives and get them to see themselves from 30,000 feet. And so those are questions like, if this 5 years is a chapter in your life, what's the chapter about? And so then they could say, well, this 5-year chunk of my life is about this. What crossroads are you at? Most of us are in the middle of some sort of transition. And so what crossroads are you at? One question you can ask is how does fear show up in your life? And we're all kind of ruled by fear in one way or another. And I had a buddy who was in a job interview, and he asked the job interviewer at the end of the interview, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And she started crying because she wouldn't be doing HR at that company, but she's too afraid to leave. And when I was teaching at Yale, I would ask my students, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And every year, one or two would come up quietly afterwards and say, well, I wouldn't be at Yale. It's a great school, but it's not for me. But I'm afraid to lose the prestige. And so these are questions that are deeper questions. And you have to know somebody. You have to build up trust before you ask these kinds of questions. But they turn an ordinary conversation into a compelling conversation. And if you're a journalist trying to get somebody's life, then you really get an aspect of them that you would not get if you said, well, what do you think of immigration policy?
Well, I was just going to say, like, a lot of that probably ends up on the cutting room floor, so to speak, right? Like you're not writing a profile of somebody that you're interviewing about the economy. On the other hand, and I'm reading in here, so please tell me if I'm misdirecting or mishearing, what I think you're getting is a way better story. Like you're getting that person to show up, and for them to show up for that, those 2 or 3 lines that are going to be in your article, you've really made them feel special and valued rather than, oh, here's another reporter calling who wants to know where the economy's heading given interest rates.
Yeah. Also, it's just a better way to communicate with readers. Jesus talked in parables, and guess what? He knew what he was doing. And so, I think it was Parker Palmer who said, I try to tell little stories that communicate big things. And so, for example, if people ask me, like, why do some people support Donald Trump? And I talk to a lot of people who support Donald Trump, including members of my own family. But one example came to me years ago, maybe 7 years ago. I was in North Dakota, and I met a guy who was 70, and he was a big Trump supporter. And I said, how'd you come to believe, come there? And he said, let me tell you about the best day of my life. It happened 35 years ago, and I was about 35 at the time. And I was foreman for a section of a plant that made refrigerator units, the kind that goes on buildings, office buildings. And they changed the technology in the plant, and they laid me off because I wasn't qualified to work there anymore. And so I thought I'd just sneak away, no fuss. And so I packed up my stuff in a box in my little office, and I opened the office door, and there was a double line of 3,600 people, all the employees in the plant. And they formed a double line from his office door through the plant, through the parking lot, to the garage, to his car door. And he walked through a double line of people applauding him, Just they wanted to show him what a good person he had been, and they were going to miss him. And he told me that was the best day of my life. And every day, every job I've had since has been worse, for lower pay, for less secure hours. My mother-in-law is 99. We can barely leave the house because we have to take care of her 24/7. And so he said, my life has gotten worse for 35 years. So that guy, Donald Trump, is offering a change, and that's what I need. And you may not agree with him about the way he votes, so you may agree with him, but you get where he's coming from. And so if just one little story can give you an important insight into the way why a lot of people supported one candidate or another.
Sounds like a lot of empathy. It sounds like understanding, because, I mean, you've had different opinions about Trump over the years, but I think, one of the divides in the US, where most of the listeners to this podcast are, is you assume the other side, whatever the other side happens to be with your perspective, doesn't make any sense. But to them, it's completely logical.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends who were Trump supporters, and I run into a lot of people. There's a guy at the gym who's always wearing a Trump shirt, and he jokes with me about how much I criticize Trump. And I found it very easy to be strongly critical of Donald Trump on a lot of different fronts, and also have no animosity at all to people who support him. And my belief is, A, I'm not going to lose a friendship over politics. Politics is just not that important. Second, I think Trump is the wrong answer to the right question. I think a lot of the people who support Donald Trump support him because there's something really wrong in their lives and something really wrong that they see in America. And so they're making the best effort they can to create some kind of change. And I may not agree with that, but it's not going to get in my way of trying to understand them. And one of the virtues about being a journalist is it trains you just to understand, don't judge. And so once I was in Jordan, I was covering the Middle East, and there had just been and I was having dinner with a group of mostly elderly Jordanian men. And if you've covered the Middle East and you go to Arab countries, you know the hospitality there is through the roof. They're unbelievably warm. And they brought out their granddaughters to kiss our cheeks, the guests. And then in the middle of the meal, I asked the elderly gentlemen, who were all judges and involved in the judicial system there in Jordan, there's just been this mass murder at a discotheque called Dolphinarium in Tel Aviv. And some terrorists shot and murdered 19 Israeli teenage girls. And I said to them, what do you think? Do you support that kind of stuff? Shooting teenage girls? And they all did. They all said, yes, absolutely. Those young women were going to be breeding future Israeli soldiers, totally legitimate to kill them. And that's a point of view, believe me, I do not share.
Yeah.
I don't think it's okay to shoot teenage girls. But my job was just there to understand them and to communicate the way they saw the world. And journalism is good training in that. I ran across a little anecdote. Here's one of my little stories by a guy named Rabbi Erwin Kukla. And he had a congregant who's had a brain injury. And sometimes she just fell to the ground. And she said, people rush to help me up because they're so uncomfortable seeing an adult lying on the floor. But at those moments, what I really need is for somebody to get on the ground with me. And that, to me, is a very good definition of empathy. It's being willing to get on the ground with somebody else, even if it feels uncomfortable for you. And believe me, I don't always live up to that standard, but
no, me neither.
It's what I shoot for anyway.
It's interesting because you're telling those stories, and it really resonates with me, David. And yet that seems to be what's draining out of the bathtub in our culture right now is empathy. Right? Like, we just don't see a lot of it publicly. We don't see it in the diatribe. We don't see it in our politics. We don't see it in our journalism, so to speak. When you think about remedies for the leaders who are listening to this conversation, what are some ways that you think we can practically restore empathy and civility into the dialogue? Like, you're doing that privately, but you're also attempting to do that publicly. What advice do you have for us on that front?
Yeah, well, my little attempt to do something about this was to write this book a couple of years ago called How to Know a Person. And the subtitle is The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. And one of the theses of that book is that over the last 2 generations or so, we have just not taught coming generations how to treat each other with kindness and consideration and respect. And these are just basic social skills. Like, how do you sit with someone who's grieving? How do you sit with someone who's depressed? How do you break up with someone without crushing their heart? How do you offer criticism in a caring way? Just basic skills like how do you end a conversation gracefully? Like nobody ever taught me that. I was at my 5th high school reunion years ago, and my only move in a cocktail party setting to end a conversation was to say, well, I'm going to go to the bar and get another drink. So after my 20 minutes of my high school reunion, I'm so drunk I have to leave the reunion because I'd gone to the bar 6 times to get a drink just so I could end the conversation. But, finally I just read, like, what you should say is, Carey, I really enjoyed spending time with you. I particularly liked what you said about your childhood. That was fascinating to me. It's been a pleasure being with you. And all you gotta do is thank them, mention something interesting they said, and that's a graceful way to end a conversation. But we have not taught people these skills. And I had a woman who was a student of mine, and she said, I've had 4 boyfriends in my life, and all of them ghosted me at the end. They all just disappeared. And so, of course, I think the next guy's going to ghost me. Of course, I'm distrustful.
Why wouldn't
and nobody had taught those kids, the guys, that A, you have to have that breakup conversation, and B, here's how to do it. And so I just think basic social skills are part of the problem of why we're not connected with one another.
Thinking about the big societal shifts, you've been on the beat, so to speak, for 4 decades. And what have you seen change the most? I know you've written numerous pieces on some of the shifts you've seen in our politic and our culture, in the way we treat each other. But when you look, and we have a lot of young leaders listening, who don't really remember the 80s, don't remember the 90s. But when you look back over my lifetime, your lifetime, we're similar age and stage, David, what do you think has shifted the most in our generation?
I think we're in the middle of, and a couple decades into, really 2.5 decades into, some sort of spiritual and relational crisis. And it shows up as the mental health rising, the 30% rise in suicide. The number of people who say they have no close friends is up by 4-fold since 2000. The number of Americans who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category is up by half since 2000. 36% of Americans say they're lonely. 45% of high school students say they're persistently hopeless and despondent. And the most important stat there is social trust. When I was a kid, and that would have been in the 70s or so,
Same.
If you ask people, do you trust your neighbors? The people right around you, are they trustworthy? 60% said yes. Now we're down to 30%. And 19% of millennial and Gen Z. The younger you go now, the more distrusting people are. And if somebody presented Gen Z with this statement, do you agree with the following? Most people are selfish and out to get you. And 72% of Gen Z said, yes, I agree with that. That's the way the world is. And I used to ask my students, do you think human nature is fundamentally good or fundamentally bad? And there was a plurality in every class that said fundamentally bad. People are basically selfish. And that's just a shift in tone of our public life. Distrust, separation, animosity. And I think a lot of the distemper in our politics flows from that distemper. And in our churches, I have a friend who says, that spiritually healthy people in my congregation are quiet and laying low. And the spiritually unhealthy people are loud and demanding things. And so that's just part of the fabric of all sorts of organizations. And it's made it so much harder to be a leader these days, and also much harder to be a follower, by the way. One of the tough things about being young, and I was up at Williams College not long ago, and one of the students there, a very bright kid, said, we're the most rejected generation. And what he meant by that is if you apply to competitive schools, like you apply to Harvard, 96% of the people who apply get rejected. If you apply to a summer internship, I ran into a woman who applied to 40 and got rejected by 39. I ran into some other students who applied to, they said I have to apply to 150 to 250 internships to make sure I can get one for each summer. And the rest are rejected. Then you get on campus and you think you're going to join the little club that helps lead student tours. Well, at Harvard, that little club rejects 88% of the applicants. And so this is just rejection up and down the line. And I'm not even talking about what I think is the harshest rejections when you get out of school, whether it's high school or college, and you're applying online for jobs. You're, in my view, lost in the 7th circle of Indeed hell, because you send out hundreds of applications. You don't know if anybody's reading them. Maybe some algorithm is going through them. And you just super hard to get a job now. And I had one young woman who was in the middle of this process. And she said, sometimes I wish I was young in the 90s. It would have been so much easier. And I told her, well, I was kind of young in the 90s, and it was a lot easier. And so it
was easier. No, it's funny. Scott Galloway's been on this show, and we talked about a very similar thing I've heard him talk about a very similar thing, David. Like, I was in school in the 80s and the 90s, school being university, and like, I don't know that I would get in today. And it was just a lower playing field.
Yeah. When I went to the University of Chicago, they accepted 74% of applicants, which is good because I was a very C student in high school. And now they don't accept 74%, they accept 4%. And so the competition at all these places has just gotten phenomenal. And when I teach, one of the joys of teaching is not only was I not as talented as all my students are, nobody was as talented as all the students are. So on the one hand, they've become super high achievers. On the other hand, some of them have turned into little automatons of achievement who are they're just phenomenal at jumping through the next hoop. But when they get out in the world and they have to chart their own course and there are no more hoops, they're lost. And so I met a kid recently who he was offered a job by a consulting firm at 19, sophomore year. He hadn't figured out what he wanted to do with his life. He was just desperate to not be rejected. So he grabbed the job at 19, and now maybe his love is in being a consultant, but maybe he'll be doing PowerPoint decks for his 20s and he'll hate it. But he did want to have the period of like wandering to figure out who I am. But that period is hard but necessary.
What else has changed in your lifetime that you're really noticing? Our trust, our social connections?
Yeah, I mean, I cover politics. So, I was given a good piece of advice when I first got this job at the Times to interview 3 politicians every day. And I did that for many years. And I can tell you they're all emotional freaks of one sort or another. But I felt they did know each other in the Senate in particular. And that's gone. That to watch institutions like the U.S. Congress totally fall into incompetence has been sobering. Then the biggest change is I was a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal in the 90s. And I lived abroad and I covered the end of apartheid in South Africa. I covered the end of the Soviet Union. I covered the reunification of Germany. I covered the Oslo peace process in the Middle East. So I covered good news for 5 years.
Yeah, it was quite the decade.
And, I remember I was in Russia, in Moscow, and there was at the end of the Soviet Union, the Soviets staged a coup. They wanted to get the country back from the Democrat Boris Yeltsin. And Yeltsin stood in front of the Russian parliament building on a tank, and he basically told the Soviets, "Shoot me, I dare you." And I saw the tanks rolling through Moscow, so I rushed over to the Russian parliament building where Yeltsin was. And I met an old lady named Valentina Kosieva. She was like 93. And so, again, talking about life stories, I asked her a life story. And it turned out she had grown up in the household of the Tsar before the revolution. When the revolution happened, she was lined up to be executed by the Reds, the communists. And her mother begged the executioners not to shoot her, and they didn't, so she lived. Then her first husband disappeared and went off to the Gulag in Siberia in the 1930s, and she never saw him again. Her 2 sons were killed in the Battle of Stalingrad, bayoneted by the Nazis. Her second husband in the 1950s, in the middle of the night, they raided her apartment. They took him away. She never saw him again. She was a member of the Kalmyk people, which is a Muslim community in Russia. And she was sent into internal exile with her people in the 1950s. So every bad event that happened in the Soviet Union happened to her. And my brilliant interviewing style was just like, and then what happened? And then what happened? And then what happened? And she told me this remarkable story. And I remember thinking, it's all coming to an end. We are converging as a world. Tyranny is going away. Democracy is spreading. Democratic capitalism is spreading. And it seemed like we were in an era of convergence. But then in the mid-90s, there was one little event I covered and I didn't pay much attention to, the Yugoslav Civil War. But that turned out to be the most predictive event of that whole era because we were entering the age of democratic retreat, of ethnic tension, of strongmen, and authoritarianism. And history has turned around.
And here we are 30 years later.
Yeah. And now we've got Erdogan in Turkey, and we've got Viktor Orban, we've got China and Xi Jinping, like Vladimir Putin. So it's become a much uglier world, and I would not have anticipated that 25 years ago.
The 90s were, I still remember, I've got that image. I was in law school watching it on TV. You were there with Yeltsin on the tank, with the Berlin Wall collapsing. On the back behind me on my shelf, I've got a piece of the Berlin Wall that spoke in Germany last year, and they gave it to me as a gift, which was so kind. But watching that happen in real time, and Reagan and Gorbachev shaking hands. If you're of our vintage, you remember that. I was in my 20s at the time when that happened. But it was incredible. And Jordan Peterson's thesis is, no, the 20th century was brutal. And, there was this renaissance at the end where exactly what you said, it looked like it was all coming together. And now there's another frequent guest on this podcast, Mark Sayers, who's just a brilliant cultural commentator. And he's like, no, we're back to how most of human history has been over the last, millennia, where it's tribal, it's difficult, it's people pitted against people, it's systems against systems. And I'd love any further take on that. I noticed when movies started to become dystopian 20 years ago, I'm like, why is it so dystopian? And it became, a predictor of, I think, the world that we're kind of living in right now. Do you expect more of a dystopian future? Do you see a path toward peace or to the way it was in the 90s? What are you seeing?
I'm known at the Times as the unrealistic optimist. And so I maintain that posture. And so, I think we humans learn. And I more or less agree with Steven Pinker, who wrote a book years ago called The Angels of Our Nature, who pointed out that violence has been dropping. Cruelty has been dropping. Human dignity has been on the advance. We've seen the greatest reduction in poverty in world history over the last 40 or 50 years. And so I do think human beings figure out a way to make life a little more civilized. That bear baiting, Colosseum gladiators, watching people murder, watching public executions, we no longer go for that. And slavery, we no longer go for that. And when it was a norm. And so I do think things ebb and flow. And one of the reasons they get better, is because we become good at moral formation. We become good at teaching coming generations how to be kind and considerate to other human beings in the complex circumstances of life. And our founders, America's founders at least, took a look at human beings and they said, democracy is the toughest form of government. It requires the most of people. And if we're going to create a democracy out of human beings who are wonderfully made, but basically broken and selfish, we've got to do a lot of moral formation. And moral formation is like a pompous word, but my favorite definition comes from the Gospel of Ted Lasso. And he was asked in the first season of that show, what's your goals for your football team? He says it's not to win championships, it's to make these young fellas better versions of themselves on and off the field. And that's moral formation, making people better versions of themselves. And it used to be an obsession with every school. Our job is not to turn out kids who can get into Harvard. Our job is to turn out kids of good character. And there was a headmaster of something called the Stowe School in England who said, my job is to turn out students who are acceptable at a dance, invaluable at a shipwreck. The kind of people you can count on when times are hard. And, I was lucky enough to be involved in a morally formative institution. I've been lucky enough to be in several. But one that illustrates how moral formation works. I've been working for more than 20 years at the PBS NewsHour, public broadcasting news show. And the first 10 years, my host and boss was a guy named Jim Lehrer. And when I said something smart, I could see Jim's eyes crinkle with pleasure. And when I said something crass or stupid, I could see his mouth turn down with displeasure. And so for 10 years, I just tried to chase the eye crinkle and avoid the mouth downturn. And that's how he taught me how to do things the NewsHour way. He created a moral ecology. And that's what leaders do. They create a moral ecology, and not just for me, but for everybody on the team. And Jim has been dead for a number of years now, but the moral ecology he created is still there at the NewsHour. And that's a beautiful legacy to leave. And if you go to some institutions are thick and some are thin. Some you pass through them and they don't leave a mark. They're just kind of bland and neutral. But some are thick. You meet a guy who's been in the Marines, a woman or man who's been in the Marines, you know it. They mention how much the Marine changed their life. You meet a Morehouse man, a guy who went to Morehouse College, you know it. He's a Morehouse man. It just shows. And thick institutions are not afraid to be distinct. They're not afraid to be unlike other organizations. In thick institutions, there are rituals. In thick institutions, there's often music involved because it's hard to be distant after you danced with them. In thick institutions, they have a clear purpose and everybody knows their role. In thick institutions, when people leave the institutions, they want to bring the culture with it. So it used to be people were executives at Procter & Gamble, say, a legendary company. When they would leave Procter & Gamble, they brought the Procter & Gamble culture to wherever they were going because they found it so valuable. And in thick institutions, there's joy in the house. There's just some happiness to it. And that's how you leave a mark on people. And it's a great act of leadership to create an organization that's thick and that is formative, rather than you just pass through it and you don't really think about it. It doesn't touch you.
That's a nice dovetail into your own character and spiritual formation, which has been a centerpiece of your work and also some of your books. Do you want to give us a brief spiritual history of David Brooks?
Sure. I'll give it in 35 seconds.
35 seconds. Yeah, that's all we got.
Yeah.
All we got. Yeah.
I grew up in a Jewish home and a really strong Jewish identity. I was really raised by my grandfather, who was an immigrant mentality, Lower East Side of Manhattan.
So like conservative, Orthodox?
We were conservative.
Conservative, okay.
But I went to a Christian school called Grace Church School on 10th Street and Broadway. If anybody knows where the Strand bookstore is in New York, it's right by there. And I even sang in the choir. And because it was New York, we were...
Why did they put you in a Christian school if you were Jewish?
Because it was the best school in Lower Manhattan. And so our choir, because it's Lower Manhattan, was 30% Jewish. And so we would sing the hymns, but we wouldn't sing the word Jesus to square with our religion. And so the volume in the church would go down and then come back up. And so I grew up, and then I went to a Christian camp for 15 years, also Episcopalian. And so I grew up with those two stories rattling around in my head, the story of Exodus, which was the story of my people, but also the Jesus story, which is, a transfixing story. And I thought they were both wonderful stories, but I didn't believe in God, so they didn't seem real to me.
So you're an atheist. Would you have been agnostic or atheistic Jew then?
I was too cowardly to say atheistic, so I would have said agnostic, but because I was always around religion. And when I first got married, and for several decades thereafter, we kept a kosher home, sent our kids to Jewish day schools. And so I was certainly around a lot of religion. I just didn't have faith. And then in my early 50s, the materialist categories I had for the world did not explain reality as I perceived it. I had like numinous experiences and with greater frequency. And one of them happened in New York City. And if people know New York, the second ugliest spot in New York is Penn Station, where the Amtrak trains come in. And the first ugliest spot is the subway station next to Penn Station. And I was on the subway, and I just had the sensation that all the people in it had souls that were shimmering and soaring or suffering or stagnating. But there was some piece of each person that has no size, color, weight, or shape, but gave them infinite value and dignity. And once you believe there's some unmaterial spiritual essence to a person, then believing there's a spiritual essence in the universe becomes a kind of short step. And so I was wandering and searching. And when you're searching and seeking in public, I learned that what Christians do is they give you books. And so over the course,
give you books. Yeah.
So over the course of several months, I got probably 500 or 600 books, only 350 of which were different copies of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. So I got hundreds of those. And slowly it seeped in that, what surprised me about faith, and it was non-dramatic. There was not like some moment where I'm sitting in my room and Jesus walks through the wall and says, "Come follow me." It was more like you're sitting on a train, and everybody around you is doing normal stuff. They're reading the paper, drinking their coffee. And it seems normal and gradual. But you look out the window and you realize you've come a long way. There's a lot of ground behind you. And you're no longer in the city of atheism or secularism. You're in some kind of city of belief. You've crossed some boundary. And you realize, I believe in God. And it came to me, frankly, mostly, I feel more Jewish than ever because I think those stories of Exodus are real. But I also found that the Beatitudes are the spot that moved me the most in Scripture. That they are where, as some writer wrote, where the spiritual splendor of God comes through in the Sermon on the Mount. And so I tell my friends I can't unread Matthew. And so I feel both, but my Jewish friends say you don't get to be both. You can't be. I insist that the Jesus I love and admire, was a Jew. He was a Jew. And when you see Jesus through the Jewish lens, he's not a wispy guy with blonde hair and two fingers sticking up in the air. He's a guy who comes from the most rugged place in Israel. And he comes into the temple and he takes on all the power structures and he topples all of them all at once. And so it's a revolutionary period. It's a violent period. And Jesus the Jew is just a total badass. And so you see him, sometimes I resent, the Oxford Jesus, like C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien. As much as I love those two writers, their version of Jesus was pretty he was pretty British, like stiff upper lip, very graceful, Aslan, very polite. But that's not how I see the actual person shown to us in the Gospels. And so I've come to that spot where it's been really more than a decade, 12 years since I had coming to faith. And the thing that shocks me is faith has not felt like belief to me. It's not felt like a possession, something I possess. It's felt like a longing, a taste of something and a longing for it. One of my heroes is Dorothy Day, who wrote a book called A Long Loneliness. And what she meant by loneliness was not solitude. She meant the loneliness for God, the longing for God, the hunger for God. And there was an early church father who said that heaven is endless longing. And that appeals to me. I feel it as a longing. So some days I feel faith intensely. Some days feel nothing. And it's not belief or doubt. It's not that. It's intensity or dryness. And that's how faith appears to me, not as a belief set of creeds, but really as an implanted longing in my soul for something of infinite value.
It's very C.S. Lewis, actually.
Yeah, well, I've certainly, as much as I badmouth Oxford Jesus, Lord knows I've spent enough time reading C.S. Lewis, who is...
I might, David, have my dates confused a little bit. Was that around the time you were thinking through the issues that became The Second Mountain?
It was The Second Mountain was written about 7 years later after all these changes had occurred. And so I was in the middle of a book called The Road to Character, and I was transfixed by Augustine. And Augustine was basically a successful yuppie. He goes to Milan, he's a good lawyer, and he has the world at his feet, but he realizes he's got this spiritual longing, this hunger that is not being met. And as he famously said, our hearts are restless until we rest in you. And then I was reading and teaching Dorothy Day. And Dorothy Day, there's one story that sort of signifies to me the kind of longing that I resonate with. She was asked at the end of her life, and she was a woman who not only served the poor her whole life, but lived with the poor and really identified with the poor. She led the most Christiform life it's possible to imagine. And at the end of her life, she was a beautiful writer. A guy named Robert Coles asked her, have you ever thought of writing a late-in-life memoir, summarizing your whole life? And she said, yeah. In fact, once I sat down with a legal pad, and I wrote at the top, A Life Remembered by Dorothy Day. And she said, and I sat there, and I thought of the Lord, and his visit to us those many centuries ago. And I was just grateful to have had him on my mind this whole time. And I realized I didn't need to write anything. And when she said that, though, when I read about that, I was just grateful to have had him on my mind this whole time. That's a kind of beautiful serenity and really surrender to faith. And when you see examples like that, you just think, wow, it's a beauty that we're all drawn to, I think.
One of the things that you were blessed with was a friendship with Tim Keller. And if you wouldn't mind talking about that, I mean, you wrote about him at different times. When he passed a couple of years ago, you wrote a beautiful piece. I only had the opportunity to meet him 3 times, but had him on the podcast. And just, it was a class in and of himself, like class unto his own. I would love, how did you meet him? How did your friendship start? And maybe just describe the relationship you had and the Tim Keller you knew.
Yeah. Well, it started when I was in this period of searching, and I'd heard about Tim Keller and listened to his sermons and read some of his books.
Can I ask how you heard about him? Because, I mean, he was a nobody who came to New York in 1989.
Yeah. By the time this all happened, it was 2013, so he was a big deal.
Yeah.
I had read
Big church.
I had read The Meaning of Marriage, which he wrote with his wife, Kathy, were one of the greatest books on marriage of any kind. And I'd read a bunch, and then we had a lot of mutual friends. And so I was in this wandering phase, and it was a period of lostness. And so I just called him up and said, "Can I have a conversation with you?" And he kindly said yes. So I began meeting with him. And then we were in some similar social circles. And then we, some friends years ago, formed a book club. And he was in the book club with a guy named Mike Gerson, and I think it's now public. We can talk about it. And so every book club could have been the Tim Keller press conference. And
Yes.
Because
he would have remembered the whole book.
Yeah. And so he could have just dominated, but he very graciously just let us do our theological ramblings. But he had as sharp a mind as it's possible to imagine. And I mentioned earlier in the podcast my need to write everything down on Post-it notes. He had all this stuff in his head. And so I would say, how do you do the sermons? There are so many quotes, there's so many facts you've read, philosophers like Charles Taylor. Where do you keep you must have note cards and note cards. He said, no, it's just up here in my head. And someday it's going to go. But if anybody, I had a friend who went to a church in DC, and when the pastor would get up to give a sermon, he would excuse himself and go outside and listen to a Keller sermon and then come back in after it was over, because Tim's sermons are so good. And the thing that's amazing about him is not only his brain, which was really phenomenal, but I think what's so impressive is that for the first couple decades, he pastored a small church in rural Virginia where 5% of the people had college degrees. And even though he was a great intellectual, he found a way to communicate with them. And he didn't write any books in those years. He said, "I'm not ready. I'm a pastor." And so that's a real. He's not like, I don't know if I know I could not have done that. I'm like, I operate at a certain level. I would like to write every day, but Tim was willing to just do pure service. And then when he moved to New York and was starting Redeemer, books poured out of him in profusion. And so he's just one of the great pastoral leaders of the kind.
How did he pastor you in that season?
Very logically. Like he would.
Really?
Yeah,
okay.
It was all like, let's consider what's happened here. Let's consider whether your behavior conforms to what God asks of us. And it was clear. It was not super like huggy, and it was not like getting pastored by Oprah or whatever I imagine that to be like. It was rigorous and clear and sometimes tough mannered. And so it was not like being hugged. It was like being reasoned with. And he reached out to me out of the kindness of his heart. He didn't need to talk to me, but so he had that kindness in there. But the way he was related was through public philosophy, really, and public theology. And when he got sick, when he got cancer, he was the kind of guy who did not want to talk about cancer. He wanted to talk about the future of the church, the reforms that might be needed to repair the church. He wanted to talk about Tolkien, and he wanted to talk about, he loved the essay Tolkien wrote that said the Jesus story is a true myth, a myth that actually happened. And so what does it mean to be a myth? And so I remember once he called into our book group from the ER, and he was having a bad night. And so he's all wired up there, and the hospital lights are beeping, and he's having a strong argument about whatever book we happen to be reading that week. And they're just a golden searching intellect.
Any other, I was with a group of people who pastor large churches in America, and we were in the pool at this place, and these are great people. I'm not throwing my friends under the bus, but his comment, he's in his mid-40s, he looked around and he goes, there's not a Tim Keller in this pool. And he has a point. We lost a giant in him, and we've lost a few giants over the last 10 years, 15 years in the church. But when you're thinking about young leaders and you think about the characteristics that made Tim, some of that was freak of nature, God's gifting, a brain that was unlike, like in all the interviews I've done, hundreds and hundreds, there's no one like Tim Keller. I mean, my goodness, more meaning in a sentence than many of us have in a lifetime. But I'm wondering what the emulatable characteristics of Tim, from your perspective, somebody who knew him up close and personal, might be.
Well, his brain is hard to replicate. But Tim was part of the conversation. He knew what year it was. And so what is going on in the culture now? The only person I think who can rival that also died recently, a guy named Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi of the UK for many years. And so he was going to read the philosophers like Charles Taylor. He was going to read Christopher Lasch, who wrote a book about the revolt of the elites. He was going to also read people like N.T. Wright and people more in the Christian tradition. And so he was going to do the reading and say, well, what is going on in the culture right now? And when I started my career, my heroes were writers who wrote in America between 1955 and 1965. And they wrote big books. Like Jane Jacobs wrote a book called The Life and Death of Great American Cities. Rachel Carson wrote a book called The Silent Spring. There was a guy named Daniel Bell who wrote a book called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. And so they were slightly more intellectual than journalists and slightly less academic than academics. And they wrote big books, big ambitious books, trying to take on the key issues of the time. So one of my heroes is a theologian named Reinhold Niebuhr. And Niebuhr wrote a book called The Nature and Destiny of Man. That covers a lot of ground.
Yeah.
And so they weren't afraid to take on the big subjects. And Keller was a little like that. The people he read were public intellectuals of that sort, not necessarily academics, but the big thinkers. And what was remarkable about Tim is he stayed curious. And so his mind was changing his whole life. I went through a period, my wife and I did, of church shopping. And it was a hard period and I shouldn't go to church expecting to find content. That's not why you go to church. But I'm a writer. I like somebody who's going to give a sermon that I'll find interesting.
Content's helpful.
Yeah. And so many as we were church shopping, so many of the sermons were Christianity 101. It was over and over again. God is love. God is love. I went to a church and the pastor was preaching on Jesus saying, I come bearing a sword. And that's always been an interesting passage. And the pastor said, well, this shows God is love. And I was like, well, it seems a little more complicated than that. And so the need to for the pastor to keep asking himself fresh questions so they can stay sharp. That's what Tim did. Every week there was something he was trying to figure out. And so his mind was always on the move. And he wasn't content with the settled cliches or Christianity 101. And so that level of curiosity, I think that you can copy. And
the constant learning, the reading every day, the attention to culture. I'm curious, if Tim was alive today, it's been a couple of years now, what do you wish he would weigh in on? The world has changed since 2023.
Yeah, that's true. I think as he was dying, I remember I was once with him and he had this 10-point plan for what the church needed. And everyone else was like, I used to go to these conferences, the church is in crisis, the church is in crisis. And the first 3 days of the conferences would be different discussions of how bad the crisis is. Whether it's the abuse crisis, whether it's whatever. And then the day 3 would be, now we're going to figure out what to do next. Now we're going to come up with solutions. And that day 3 was always mumble, don't really know what to do. But Tim did know what to do. So he said, you need a lot more church planning because the only way you get converts is by planning a new church. B, we need a funnel of Christians into the Ivy League. And so we've got to create that funnel. C, we've got to do this. D, we've got to do this. And so he had like a 10-point plan, all with big actionable items. And so it's very easy to say what's wrong. It's very hard to come up with a practical plan for what to do next. And Tim was weighing in on that. And if he were, it's hard for me to know what he would be talking about if he were around today. He would be wrestling with the rise of cruelty, I would say. I live in Washington, D.C., and if you live here, 20, 30, 40, 50 people who've lost their jobs. And in many cases, their life projects. Many people say they were scientists. They were doing research into this project or that. Their lab has been gutted. They've been fired. And the thing they dedicated their life to it seems to be all going away. And so that level of cruelty, to me, for no real money saving. And even like USAID, one of the other guys in our men's group was a guy named Michael Gerson, who was President George W. Bush's chief speechwriter. And he was instrumental in creating PEPFAR, the president's HIV initiative in Africa. And I went to Africa with Mike, and where before I watched people die. And after PEPFAR, going to the hospital was like going to the CVS, the drugstore. You would get your drugs and you'd live. And so I saw America save 25 million lives in Africa. And it was such a proud moment to be an American. And Mike was part of that. So Mike could say, I was part of a program that saved 25 million lives. And that's been gutted. And Mike is not here to see that. Maybe that's a good thing. And I think Tim would also be wondering about, what are we called to do in the world? If not spend a few bucks and save 25 million lives. And so I think that's a moral turn that he would want to figure out.
Well, that coincides sort of with the arc of your career as well. You're still political commentator, cultural commentator, but, my sense of the body of your work over the decades, and we're all changing and evolving, is you become much more concerned or focused on the moral and the social issues, and have had a lot to say to the church, as somebody who's fairly new to it in the last 10, 15 years, a lot to say about the church too, and have written very effectively on that. What unexplored territory are you interested in pursuing? Like when you think about the future, where would you like to make a contribution, and then how would you like to make it?
Well, the book I'm just starting is on motivation and desire. And I've come to believe, which is an obvious point, which is that we overvalue intelligence in our society. We sort people by college, by how smart they are and how good they are in academic settings. But the most important quality to have, in my view, is determination. It's desire. It's the ability to the willingness to walk through walls, and the willingness, as we talked with Tim Keller, to be different at 30 than you were at 20, different at 40 than you were at 30, different at 60 than you were at 50. It's just the ability to just keep going forward and growing and growing and growing and learning and learning and learning. And that takes desire and motivation. And we know a lot about cognition, how we think, the decision-making process. Danny Kahneman wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. We know a lot about emotion, how our emotional lives work, where emotions come from. But we don't know much about what they call conation, which is a word we don't even use.
Yeah, I don't even know what that word means.
It means drive and motivation. And it comes from our reasoning process is sort of mostly in the prefrontal cortex in the front of our brain. Our emotional processes are down somewhat in the amygdala and other places. But there's the midbrain, which is where the reward centers are, where dopamine happens. And so I want to know, motivations are odd. Like, why do I desire some things and not others? Why do I love the woman who's my wife but not somebody else? Why do I like shrimp but I don't like scallops? Like, why is that?
And why are my motives so mixed? There's also that.
Or what is the deepest passion of my soul? I had a friend who was a philosopher named Leon Cass who said people are not determined by their IQ, by their height, by their skin color, by their ethnicity. People are determined and can be sorted by the ruling passion of their soul. Some people, their ruling passion is for understanding. Some people, the ruling passion is for belonging. Some people, the ruling passion is for pleasure. And to ask yourself, what is the ruling passion of my soul? What do I really want to be doing? And if you don't find that ruling passion, you'll do what the world tells you to do. And you'll want what the world tells you to want. And that's a good way to half live your life. It's a good way to answer a lot of false calls, which is, the world wants me to be a banker, but then 10 years later, I'm kind of bored being a banker. And the world wants me to be whatever, a journalist, but I'm kind of bored. That's really not what I wanted. And if you don't find the ruling passion of your soul, it'll be reflected in your work because you won't have the energy and the motivation just to be in it wholeheartedly. And so I'm trying to figure out where does motivation come from? Can we change what we want? Can we inflate or inflame our urgency? How do you spot somebody who has high motivation? How do you spot somebody who doesn't? How do you find your passion if you're talking to a kid who doesn't know what he wants? How do you find a passion? So these are the questions I'm asking, and I don't have answers yet, but By the fall of
that'll be the next
2027,
book, the next project.
It'll be out the fall of 2027, so I better come up with answers by then.
David, what's a question that nobody ever asks you that you wish somebody would ask you?
That's a good question. I can think of a lot of questions where I wish nobody would ask me. But yeah, I can't come up with one right off the top of my head.
I've got one for you.
Okay.
What do you fear? Where we start?
Yeah. I'll tell you what I used to fear, and I still fear it, but I fear it a little less. I think I used to have a fear of intimacy. And so I was the kind of guy nobody confided in, because I was sending off subtle signals that I'm really not emotionally available for you. And if you present me with a problem, I don't know what to say, so I'm anxious. And I hoped over the last 10 years, I've become a little more approachable, a little more vulnerable, a little more with a capacity for intimate. It helps to have a wonderful marriage to a wonderful woman who demands intimacy. And I have some friends who, they beam love at you and they want it beamed back, but it's still not my natural affect. My natural posture is one of reserve. And I hope to grow in this direction. I've made some progress. I was at a conference in Nantucket, and the speaker, we were in an audience of maybe 500 people, and the speaker gave us all a piece of paper and on the piece of paper were lyrics to a love song. And the speaker says to the whole group, okay, find somebody in this audience you don't know, gaze into their eyes, and sing the love song to them. And if you had told me to do that 15 years ago, I would have spontaneously combusted. But I found some guy, I gazed into his eyes, I sang the love song to him, and there were no sparks. There was no chemistry between us, so we didn't fall in love. But it was a sign that, you can emotionally change a little over the course of your life. And I am a developmental psychologist, used to think that we grow up at age 21 and then we are who we are. You can't really change an adult. I totally, totally disagree with that. And I can, when my wife looks at video of me from 20 years ago, we've been married 8 years, and she says, well, I wouldn't have married that guy. and so, we soften and change and hopefully expand through life. And I'm a believer in accelerating change as the years go by.
Well, I'm with you on that. I just had a big birthday, new decade, 60. And I'm committed to growth and learning. And you always kind of hope you've arrived. And it's like, yeah, there's no arriving. But it's what I see in your work. It's what we see in Keller, that curiosity, in his case, which he carried through with him to the very end of his life, which I think makes life beautiful. David, you've got tens of thousands of church leaders listening and watching right now. And you've written about this in your various outlets. But if you wished one or two things for the capital C church, and you're talking to a lot of non-denominational mega church pastors, influential pastors, what do you wish we would do in this cultural moment? What's your advice to us?
I think the first thing I would say is be not afraid. That a lot of church leaders in my experience, feel besieged. And a lot are struggling. It's hard. It's exhausting. Their congregations are dividing over this and that. And yet, from the story I've lived in the last 15 years, I would tell church leaders, as I tell Christian college leaders, you have what the world is longing for. You have a spiritual formula. You have a body of spiritual wisdom. You have a focus on the health of the soul. And you also have an intentional way to live. And I can tell you that as someone who teaches in secular schools, my students are desperate for that. And they want moral formation. They want somebody to speak into the yearnings, the spiritual yearnings of their life. They want someone who will offer them a coherent moral order. There was a philosopher a historian named George Marsden, who wrote that what gave Martin Luther King's rhetoric such force was his belief that moral law is baked into the fabric of the universe. That segregation is not just wrong some of the time, it's always wrong. Slavery is always wrong. Betrayal is always wrong. And I think one of the causes of our loneliness is not just social disconnection. It's what you might call the privatization of morality. We've told generations of kids, come up with your own values, come up with your own truth. And unless your name is Aristotle, you probably can't do it. But B, you don't live within a moral order. And a columnist named Walter Lippmann saw this coming as early as 1955. He wrote a book called The Public Philosophy. And he wrote that if what is right and wrong is just what each individual gets to decide based on his or her own feelings, we have left the realm of civilization. And I think we've left that realm. We're all sort of in a moral universe of one. And when I see church leaders, I see people who have the language of sin, have the language of redemption, have the language of grace. And even these words and the meanings behind them are powerful resources that are absent in the public sphere. And so I guess I would tell church leaders, we need you in the world, the public world, as people willing to have moral conversations. In my view, American society is overpoliticized and undermoralized. We talk too much about who's in the White House and not enough about how to be a good person. How do you sit with someone? How do you sit with a widow? How do you be a friend? And I found in the Christian world so much thought and practical application about how to be a slightly better person. And our as I said, our secular schools used to be all about that, but now they're not.
Yeah, the liberal arts education is dying a death in our lifetime.
And so if you could be a force I sometimes think there's a great forces of dehumanization in our culture, like technology, capitalism, brutality of our politics. And then there are some forces of humanization. And Tim Keller was a force for humanization. I think the church can be a force for humanization. I think poetry and literature can be a force for humanization. My wife edits, her name is Ann Snyder. She edits a magazine called Comment. And the tagline of Comment is public theology for the common good. And she talks about Christian humanism. And humanism is a scary word for some people because they think it's the opposite of faith. But for Christian humanism is the belief that ecce homo, Jesus was the embodiment of what humanity should look like. And what do we take from this human example to rehumanize our culture? And so I would ask church leaders to do that, just to be, public. In the 50s, there was Reinhold Niebuhr. There was Abraham Joshua Heschel. There was Father Fulton Sheen. There were church leaders who were famous in the public life because they were outspoken on public things. In the last 15 years, we had Tim Keller. And I'm not sure there were too many other people who were famous in the public sphere as not as pompous prophesiers, but just as people active in the public sphere using the resources of theology and 2,000 years of Christian social teaching to play a role in common life. And I'd love to see church leaders do that again.
I would love to see church leaders do that too, but you got to get your reps in. You got to spend 5 hours in the morning working on 1,200 words. You've got to read. I mean, I don't know how many books you've referenced in this hour and a bit we've spent together, but we're in the dozens. And the reality is most of us haven't read most of those books, but we have lots of time for our social media feeds, but not enough time for deep thought. And so maybe it's a good challenge to the next generation of leaders. It's like, get your deep thought reps in early, and over a lifetime, it goes very much in the direction your life has gone, that Tim Keller's has gone, and a handful of others has. David, this has been a fascinating conversation. I just can't thank you enough for battling through a few technical difficulties at the beginning. We got through it, and this is very, very rich. I'd love for you to point leaders to, where you're writing, where they can find your work, et cetera. I mean, obviously New York Times, Atlantic, and beyond, but are there particular sites you want to direct our attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I write for, as you say, the New York Times and the Atlantic. They cost something to read, but they're well worth it. I have a new piece in my wife's magazine, so that was hard to get into, called Comment Magazine. It's a book on why intelligence is not the same as wisdom. She has an issue on discernment. Other than that, I just write books and I talk. And so that keeps, I have about 6 jobs and keeps me busy, but there's no other places you can find me, fortunately.
Well, this has been a real gift. I want to thank you so, so much.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Carey.